Hey, welcome back to the Nero world. Today we're diving into another Nero Wolfe mystery, smart, sharp, and worth every minute. The woman arrived at the brownstone on West 35th Street at 20 minutes past 2 on a Tuesday afternoon in October, which was, as far as I was concerned, two things simultaneously: an interruption to my filing and a potential source of income for the household. Since Nero Wolfe had recently turned down a perfectly good client on the grounds that the man's necktie suggested a personality too erratic to tolerate, we could use the income. I was at my desk in the office when Fritz brought her in. She was somewhere in her early 40s, dressed in a charcoal wool coat that had been expensive once and was still good, with dark hair pinned back, in a way that suggested she'd started the day with intentions of order and had since surrendered to something more pressing. Her eyes were gray, the calculating kind, and her hands were clasped in front of her with a deliberateness that told me she'd been practicing composure in the cab over. She wasn't grieving, she was afraid. "Miss Celestine Marsh," Fritz announced, with the precise dignity of a man who considers every introduction a small ceremony, and then retreated to whatever masterwork was simmering on his stove. "Miss Marsh." I stood, because I was raised with some instincts intact. "Archie Goodwin. Please sit down." I gestured to the red leather chair across from Wolfe's desk, the client's chair, as it had come to be known, though Wolfe himself never called it that. He called it the chair of preliminary untruths, which tells you everything you need to know about his opinion of clients at the outset of a case. She sat, arranged her coat, and looked around the office with the controlled curiosity of someone who'd heard about the room and was checking it against expectations. The bookshelves, running floor to ceiling on two walls, the globe in the corner, the desk the size of a small aircraft carrier, the two chairs facing it, one of which was currently unoccupied by the man who was supposed to be sitting in it. "Mr. Wolfe will be down at 4 o'clock, I said, settling back into my own chair and pulling a notepad toward me. "He spends 2 hours in the plant rooms every afternoon, 2 to 4. Non-negotiable. I've seen him refuse to come down for a sitting United States Senator, so I wouldn't take it personally." "I see." Her voice was even and educated, with a trace of somewhere southern in it, worn smooth by years of living in New York. "I was told he was the best. He's been told that too, and it hasn't done wonders for his humility. Can I take some preliminary details while we wait? Save time?" She nodded, and I uncapped my pen. Her name, she told me, was Celestine Marsh. She was the administrative director of the Halverson Foundation, a private philanthropic organization headquartered in a townhouse on East 64th Street. The foundation had been established 12 years ago by a man named Cornelius Halverson, retired shipping magnate, amateur classicist, and apparently dedicated collector of Greco-Roman antiquities, for the stated purpose of funding scholarly research and the preservation of classical art. "And Mr. Halverson?" I asked. "Dead," she said. 3 years ago. Natural causes. Heart failure." She paused. "The foundation continues under the direction of his son, Elliot Halverson, who serves as chairman of the board." I wrote that down and then looked up. "Miss Marsh, I don't want to be rude, but so far you've told me about a dead philanthropist and a living son. Neither of those is a reason to visit Nero Wolfe on a Tuesday afternoon. What is?" She unclasped her hands, looked at them briefly, and clasped them again. "3 weeks ago," she said, "a man named Dorian Swell was murdered." "Dorian Swell," I repeated, writing it. "Who was he?" "He was the foundation's senior acquisitions consultant. He authenticated and procured antiquities for the foundation's permanent collection. He'd been with us for 6 years. And the murder? He was found in his apartment on West 81st Street on the morning of October 7th. He'd been struck on the head with a blunt object." "The police have a suspect in custody, a young man named Marcus Teal, who was Dorian's personal assistant." She stopped. "But," I said. "But Marcus Teal did not kill Dorian Swell," she said it with quiet certainty, the kind that comes not from emotion, but from information. "I know this because I know what Dorian Swell was doing in the weeks before his death, and if the police knew it too, they would understand that the motive they've constructed for Marcus is entirely wrong, and the real reason Dorian was killed is something they haven't come close to. I put the pen down. And what was Dorian Swell doing? He'd discovered, she said carefully, that several pieces in the Foundation's permanent collection were forgeries. There it was. I'd been wondering when the Foundation would enter the room as something more than background. Forgeries, I said. High quality? Exceptionally. Museum grade. Which means they were either missed by Dorian himself during original authentication, which is possible, but knowing Dorian, unlikely, or they were substituted afterward for genuine pieces that were then sold elsewhere. She held my eyes steadily. Either way, someone with access to the collection and the expertise to manage it was involved. That's a very specific category of person, I said. Yes, it is. And you haven't told the police. I've told them nothing, because whoever is responsible for the forgeries is either still at the Foundation or was until very recently. And because Dorian told me privately 2 days before he was killed, that he believed he knew who it was. He didn't name anyone. He said he needed one more piece of confirmation. She paused. He never got it. I leaned back and looked at the ceiling for a moment, which is a habit I have when I'm deciding whether a story is complicated enough to be genuine, or complicated enough to be fabricated. In this case, I couldn't tell yet, which was a good sign for its authenticity. All right, Miss Marsh, let me ask for something directly. Why come to Wolfe instead of, say, your own lawyer, or a firm with an investigations division? She met my eyes without hesitation. Because Marcus Teal is 23 years old, and if I'm wrong about any of this, going to a law firm means documents, disclosures, and the kind of institutional caution that takes 6 months to produce a memo. And Marcus Teal goes to trial in 11 weeks. She paused. And because I was told that Nero Wolfe does not fail. He doesn't like to, I said. There's a distinction. At 4 o'clock precisely, I heard the sound of the elevator, a subtle hydraulic exhalation, and then the measured tread of 270 pounds of genius crossing the hallway. The office door opened, and Nero Wolfe entered. He was wearing a yellow shirt and a dark brown three-piece suit that would have looked absurd on anyone else, and looked on him like the natural habitat of a man who considered the world's relationship with aesthetics fundamentally misguided. He was massive, not simply large, but architecturally large, the kind of big that implies structural intent, with a face that in repose suggested a disapproving Roman senator, and in animation suggested the same senator deciding which province to have raised. His eyes were dark and small and missed nothing. He crossed to his desk, settled into his reinforced chair with the particular care he gave to all transitions between standing and sitting, and looked at Celestine Marsh with the expression he reserved for clients, polite, faintly skeptical, and already calculating. Miss Marsh, he said, not as a greeting, but as a notation. Mr. Wolfe. She had recalibrated herself in the 30 seconds of his crossing the room. Whatever nervousness had been visible earlier had been neatly folded and put away. I gave her credit for that. Archie, he glanced at me. Celestine Marsh, Administrative Director of the Halverson Foundation on East 64th. Murder of one Dorian Swell, Senior Acquisitions Consultant, October 7th. Police have a Marcus Teal in custody, personal assistant to the deceased. Miss Marsh believes Teal is innocent, and that the real motive for the murder connects to a forgery scheme inside the Foundation, several pieces in the collection being fakes, the originals presumably sold off somewhere. Swell discovered this and was about to identify the person responsible. 2 days later, he was dead. I paused. 11 weeks before Teal's trial. Wolfe's gaze had moved to the middle distance somewhere above Miss Marsh's left shoulder, which meant he was listening with the part of his brain that processes rather than merely receives. Antiquities, he said. Greco-Roman, you said? Yes, she confirmed. The Foundation specializes in late Republican and early Imperial Roman sculpture, with some Hellenistic Greek pieces. The collection numbers about 60 major works. And the forgeries Swell identified? How many pieces? He mentioned at least 4, perhaps more. Wolfe's eyes returned to her face. At current market valuations, 4 pieces of significant Roman sculpture could represent anywhere from 2 million to considerably more. This is not petty theft dressed in museum clothing. This is a sustained, sophisticated operation. He paused. Who beyond yourself had regular access to the collection? She was ready for this. Elliot Halverson, the chairman. He visits the foundation 2 or 3 times a week. Dr. Frederick Nance, our collections curator, he's been with us since the beginning. Petra Swell, Dorian's sister, who manages foundation events and donor relations. And Raymond Galt, our chief financial officer, who has administrative access to all parts of the building, including the vault where the primary collection is stored. Dorian Swell authenticated the pieces originally. Many of them, yes. Others were authenticated under Dr. Nance's supervision before Dorian joined us. Wolfe was quiet for a moment. A slight compression of his lips indicated active thought. You said Swell told you he believed he knew who was responsible. Did he say or imply whether this was someone within that group? He implied it very strongly. She held Wolfe's gaze. He said, and these were his exact words, "The person who did this knows exactly how the collection breathes." I wrote it down. It was the kind of line that wanted to be written down. Wolfe turned slightly in his chair to face his orchid display on the corner stand, gave the 3 cattleyas there a brief appraisal, and turned back. Miss Marsh, you have not asked me what my fee is. I assumed it would be considerable. It will be, and I will earn it if I take this case, which I have not yet decided. You are withholding something. What makes you say that? You came to me rather than the authorities with information potentially exculpatory to a man facing murder charges. That decision, whatever your stated rationale, suggests you have a reason to keep something private that broader disclosure would expose. That is not an accusation, it is an observation. I deal in facts, Miss Marsh. Partial facts are worse than useless. They are actively misleading. So I ask again. A silence stretched between them. I watched her face go through something quiet and difficult, and then arrive somewhere decided. Dorian Swell, she said slowly, came to me because I was the one person in the foundation he was certain was not involved. He came to me because 6 months ago, I discovered a small financial irregularity in our donor processing accounts. I flagged it to Raymond Galt, who said it was a clerical error and corrected it. I let it go. She stopped. If I'd pressed it, Dorian might still be alive. I didn't press it because I trusted the wrong person's explanation. I don't know yet whether Raymond Galt is involved in the forgeries. But I know that I share some portion of whatever happened through my own failure to act. Wolfe regarded her for a long moment. Guilt, he said, is a legitimate motivation for hiring a detective, though it is rarely stated as plainly as you have just stated it. I find the candor, however belated, persuasive. He glanced at me. Archie, tomorrow morning, you will go to the foundation on East 64th Street. You will observe the premises, the collection, and whatever personnel are willing to speak with you. He looked back at Miss Marsh. You will arrange for my associate to have access. As what? She asked. In what capacity? That, said Wolfe, is Archie's department. He invents covers with a creativity I find both useful and slightly alarming. I grinned. Journalist doing a piece on private foundations and classical art. It's vague enough to explain any question and respectable enough to get answers. She considered it and nodded. I can make that work. Good. Wolfe unfolded his hands. I will also require the police file, to whatever extent you can obtain it, and a list of every piece in the Foundation's collection, with authentication documentation and provenance records going back to original acquisition. He paused. And I will require that you do not speak to any of the individuals I have named, Halverson, Nance, the Swell woman, Galt, about this engagement. Not a word, not an implication. I understand. I'm not certain you do, but we will proceed as though you do. He rose from his chair, signaling that the meeting was over with the finality of a court gavel. My fee will be communicated to you in writing. If you find it objectionable, you may say so, and I will explain why you are wrong." After she left, I sat back in my chair and looked at Wolfe, who had gone to stand before his orchids, touching the edge of a pot with one thick finger. "Well," I said. "Interesting," he said, which from Nero Wolfe is approximately equivalent to anyone else saying extraordinary. A murder dressed as a crime of passion that is in fact a crime of exposure. The killer did not murder Dorian Swell out of anger or impulse. He murdered him out of calculation, the same calculation that produced the forgeries. We are dealing with a cold intelligence, Archie. 4 suspects, if we use her list. 5, he said. You are forgetting Miss Marsh herself. I had been forgetting Miss Marsh herself. You think she's involved? I think she is intelligent, composed, and came to me with a story that casts suspicion on 4 specific people, while artfully framing herself as a confessor to mere negligence. It may be entirely true, or it may be a more elaborate positioning. He turned from the orchids. What did her hands tell you when she discussed Raymond Galt? I thought back. They tightened, just slightly, right before she said she'd flagged the irregularity to him. Yes, said Wolfe, they did. He moved toward the door. I shall review the Foundation's public records this evening. Tomorrow you will go and look at the marble, Archie. I am curious to know what it says. Marble doesn't talk, I said. He paused in the doorway, and the ghost of something that was not quite a smile crossed his face. If you know how to listen. He went to dinner, and I sat alone in the office for a moment with my notes and my thoughts, which were, in that order, a dead man, a set of stone faces on pedestals, and somewhere behind them, a living face that had decided that silence was worth a murder. Outside, rain had started. It tapped against the brownstone windows with the steady patience of something that intends to stay. East 64th Street, between Madison and Park, is the kind of block that has decided what it is and intends to remain it indefinitely. The buildings are narrow and distinguished, the stone fronts scrubbed to a tasteful anonymity, the brass on the doorbells polished to reflect a world in which everything important happens inside, away from view. The Halverson Foundation occupied number 47, a 4-story townhouse that had been converted with enough discretion that you wouldn't know it was no longer a private residence unless someone told you. I arrived at 10:15 Wednesday morning wearing my second-best suit and carrying a notebook, which is the journalist's version of a doctor's black bag. It tells people what you are before you have to explain it. Celestine Marsh met me in the foyer, a marble-floored entrance hall with a small reception desk occupied by a young woman who looked at my press credential with the practiced neutrality of someone trained to be politely skeptical of everyone. Mr. Goodwin will be working on a profile piece, Marsh told the young woman, whose nameplate said, Helen Voss. Please give him the same access you'd give any Foundation guest. Helen Voss gave me a smile that was all surface and showed me to a waiting area with 2 chairs and a reproduction of a Roman frieze on the wall. The original, Marsh had mentioned, was in the vault downstairs. The Foundation's working spaces were on the first 2 floors. The 3rd floor held the public gallery, a small, carefully lit series of rooms where a selection of the collection was displayed for visiting scholars, and, on certain appointment-only days, the public. The 4th floor was storage and administrative offices. The vault, climate-controlled and accessible only by a coded door in the basement, held the primary collection. Marsh walked me through it in 20 minutes, brisk and efficient, pointing out the security cameras, the climate monitors, the scholarly library with its shelves of auction records and provenance documentation. She was good at her job, I could see that. The kind of administrator who has internalized the institution so completely that she can describe it from multiple angles simultaneously. Like a building she designed herself. The people you'll want to speak with, she said, as we arrived in the 2nd-floor corridor outside a row of offices, are all here today. I've mentioned to them that we may be doing a press piece. Dr. Nance is expecting you first. Dr. Frederick Nance occupied the largest office on the second floor, which was either a function of his seniority or his personality, and I suspected both. He was a man of about 62, lean in the way of people who were once thin and have remained so through stubbornness, with white hair cropped short and a face that had the angular, faintly weathered quality of someone who spends time outdoors in foreign countries looking at ruins. His office was a testament to controlled obsession. Bookshelves floor to ceiling, 2 desks, one for working and one apparently for stacking things that didn't fit on the working one, and on the wall a large map of the Mediterranean with pins in it. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, rising and extending a hand. His grip was firm and quick. "Sit down. Celestine said you were doing a profile on private foundations and classical collections?" "That's right." I settled into the chair across his desk and opened my notebook. "I'm particularly interested in the authentication process. How a foundation like this one builds a credible collection without the resources of a major museum." It was the right question to ask Nance. I could see it in the slight expansion of his posture, not vanity exactly, but the pleasure of being asked about something you genuinely know. He talked for 15 minutes about authentication methodology, provenance tracing, thermoluminescence dating for terracotta pieces, the challenges of distinguishing genuinely old marble from modern fakes, the importance of exhibition history and documented ownership chains. He was, in his element, genuinely impressive. "Dorian Swell worked closely with you on acquisition?" I asked at a pause. A slight tightening around the eyes. "He did. We had different approaches. Dorian was more intuitive, I would say, relying heavily on comparative stylistic analysis. I tend to favor the documentary record, but we complemented each other reasonably well." "His death must have been a significant loss for the foundation." "Naturally. The word was precise and nothing more. A tragedy." "Did you know him well personally?" "We were colleagues." He looked at me steadily. "Not friends, if that's what you're asking. Dorian was a complicated man. Brilliant in his way, but complicated." I made a note. "Complicated how?" Nance considered the question for a moment, with the care of a man choosing which stone to step on in a river crossing. "He was ambitious, which is fine, but his ambition occasionally outran his judgment. He had a tendency to pursue conclusions before the evidence was fully assembled." He paused. "In antiquities scholarship, that's a dangerous habit." "Did that create conflict between you?" "Differences of professional opinion, yes." He said it with the finality of a door closing. "Nothing more significant than that." I thanked him and moved on. Petra Swell had an office at the far end of the second floor, smaller than Nance's, but decorated with more warmth. Flowers on the windowsill, a pair of framed photographs of foundation events, a child's drawing tacked near the door that she'd presumably acquired through some donor relationship. She was in her mid-30s, with her brother's dark coloring in a softer arrangement, and she was, I noticed immediately, more visibly grieved than anyone else I'd met in the building. Her eyes had the faintly tender look of someone who has been crying regularly and has decided to continue living around it. "I'm sorry for your loss," I said, and meant it. "Thank you." She gestured to a chair. "Celestine said you were writing about the foundation. I'm not sure I'm the most useful person to speak to, given everything." "You handle donor relations?" "Events and development. Yes. I've been here 4 years. Dorian was the one who brought me in, actually. He thought it would be..." She paused. "He thought having family in the organization would be good for him. In a practical sense. He could trust me." She said the last 2 words with a particular weight that I filed away. "Did your brother confide in you? About his work?" She looked at the window. "Dorian confided in people selectively. He was private, even with me. We talked about work sometimes, in general terms." She stopped. "Did he seem troubled in the weeks before he died?" The question landed on her like a small weight she'd been expecting. "Yes," she said quietly. "He was distracted, preoccupied. I asked him several times if something was wrong. He said he was working through something complicated, and that he'd tell me when he was sure." Her voice was steady, but the steadiness was constructed, carefully maintained. He didn't get the chance. I asked a few more questions about the foundation's donor base, the events she organized, the general culture of the place, and she answered them with the automatic competence of someone going through a professional motion, her mind clearly elsewhere. As I stood to leave, she said without quite looking at me, "Marcus Teal didn't do it." No, I kept my voice neutral. Dorian was difficult to work for. Demanding, exacting, occasionally unkind in small ways. Marcus struggled with him. I won't pretend otherwise. She met my eyes finally, but Marcus was loyal to him. Genuinely loyal. And what they said about the argument they had the night Dorian died, I don't believe it escalated the way they're saying. Marcus isn't violent. He's 23, and he's scared, and whoever actually killed my brother has very conveniently arranged for someone else to take the weight of it. She said it evenly, as a statement of analysis rather than an accusation, and then she looked back at her window. I found Raymond Galt in a corner office on the 4th floor, which had a view of East 64th Street, and a desk organized with the obsessive precision of a man who finds external order a necessary counterweight to internal anxiety, or who wants people to think he does. He was 51, broad-shouldered, with reddish-brown hair going gray at the temples, and the complexion of someone who golfs. He stood when I came in and shook my hand with the hearty compression of a man who considers grip a form of communication. "Raymond Galt. Come in. Sit down. Celestine mentioned the piece. Happy to help." He gestured at the chair and settled back into his own with the ease of a man comfortable in his space. "What can I tell you about how we run things financially?" He was, I noted, the only person in the building who had immediately redirected to his own specific domain. We talked for 20 minutes about endowment management, acquisition budgeting, donor accounting, the complexities of nonprofit financial reporting. He was fluent and confident on all of it. The CFO mode, fully engaged. When I worked the conversation around to Swell's death, the fluency continued without visible disruption. "Terrible thing," he said. "Dorian was an asset to the foundation. Not always the easiest colleague. He had sharp elbows, professionally speaking, but talented, genuinely talented." He shook his head. "The police seemed to have their man. Sad situation all around." "You knew him well?" "Well enough. We worked in the same organization for 6 years. But Dorian's world was the collection, the scholarship, the acquisitions. Mine is the books. We didn't overlap much." "Did you ever have any professional disagreements with him?" He smiled, a smooth, practiced smile that was comfortable with the question. "Nothing significant. The occasional budget debate, like anyone in any organization. Dorian always wanted more for acquisitions than we could prudently allocate." He paused. I was usually the one to say no. He didn't always take it gracefully, but that's the CFO's job. "Any recent debates of that kind?" "Nothing out of the ordinary." He said it pleasantly, looking me straight in the eye, and it was almost convincing. Almost. I met Elliot Halverson last, in the chairman's conference room on the 3rd floor, which overlooked the gallery below through a glass interior wall. He was 44, with his father's broad forehead, and it appeared, very little else of his father. Where the elder Halverson's photographs on the foundation walls showed a man of considerable physical presence, and a face shaped by outdoor confidence, Elliot was indoor and deliberate, with the angular, contained quality of a man who has spent his life in the shadow of someone larger, and has learned to make careful use of the space. He was also, I noticed almost immediately, the most politically sophisticated person in the building. Where Nance gave me expertise, Petra gave me grief, and Galt gave me performance, Elliot Halverson gave me management. Every answer was shaped, not falsified exactly, but structured, placed where it would be most useful, and nothing more. "The foundation represents my father's life work," he said, when I asked about his relationship to it. "My role as chairman is custodial. I try to honor his vision while adapting to contemporary realities. A pause. He cared deeply about the authenticity of the collection. Deeply. Not just in a scholarly sense, but in a moral one. He believed these objects had survived 2,000 years and deserved to be preserved and displayed with absolute integrity. And Dorian Swell upheld that? Dorian was exceptional at his work, Halverson said. His death is a genuine loss, for the institution and, I hope, as a human being. You say I hope. Were there reasons to doubt it? He looked at me for a moment with calm appraisal. That's a sharp question for a profile piece, Mr. Goodwin. I smiled. Force of habit. I spent a few years on the crime desk before I moved to features. I see. He decided to answer. Dorian Swell was talented and committed to his work. His personal conduct was sometimes irregular. He had relationships within the organization that were at various times complicated. He spread his hands slightly. But I wouldn't speak ill of him now. It wouldn't be appropriate. Of course. I wrapped up the interview and found my way back down to the entrance hall, where Celestine Marsh met me by the door. Useful? She asked quietly. Very, I said. One question before I go. The financial irregularity you mentioned to Wolfe, the one you flagged to Galt 6 months ago, how large was it? She considered me carefully. About $14,000. Donor processing account. A transfer that didn't match the corresponding records. And Galt said clerical error. Yes. Did you ever see documentation of the correction? A beat of silence. No, she said. He said it had been corrected. I assumed. She stopped. Right, I said. I'll be in touch. Outside, I stood on the sidewalk for a moment and looked back at the townhouse. Somewhere inside it, behind the marble and the provenance records and the climate-controlled vault, a cold intelligence had been operating for long enough that it had felt safe. And then Dorian Swell had started listening to what the marble said, and the cold intelligence had acted. Wolfe was going to enjoy this. He gets his best color when the problem has layers. I flagged a cab and went back to report. Wolfe listened to my report the way he always does, motionless in his chair, eyes half closed, fingers laced over the architectural summit of his midsection, giving the impression of a very large, very intelligent man who has decided that the universe's best use of himself is to process information without visible mechanical expenditure. By the time I finished, he had consumed a bottle of Remmer's beer and shown no outward sign of thought whatsoever, which meant he had been thinking continuously and intensively for the duration. Nance's phrase, he said. His ambition occasionally outran his judgment. A specifically chosen formulation. That was my read, I agreed. He was positioning himself, establishing in advance that Swell was the kind of man who jumped to conclusions. Which would be useful if Swell had jumped to a conclusion about Nance. Wolfe set his glass down. Petra Swell's assessment of Marcus Teal's loyalty. Was she being analytical or protective? Both, I said. She's smart, and she's grieving in a way that's sharpened her, rather than dulled her. She's angry, and she's thinking. I believed her. The financial irregularity Galt explained away. $14,000. In a non-profit operating on an endowment of... Wolfe glanced at a sheet of paper on his desk, which I recognized as Foundation public filings he'd apparently obtained and reviewed. Approximately $18 million, a trivial sum in context. But as a test of a system's vulnerability, it would be an entirely appropriate scale. I hadn't thought of it that way. A probe, I said. See if anyone noticed. See how they reacted. Calibrate the risk before moving on to larger things. Yes. Wolfe looked faintly satisfied in the way of a man whose hypothesis has just been confirmed by the last piece of a puzzle. And Marsh noticed, but was neutralized, told it was clerical error, given no documentation. He paused. That is elegant in its way. It also tells us something important about the timing. Galt, if it is Galt, had already begun his operation before that test 6 months ago. The probe suggests an established scheme being stress-tested, not begun. So, the forgeries could go back further than Swell knew. Or further than he'd confirmed, Wolfe corrected. He had identified 4. There may be more, significantly more. He turned his chair slightly to look out through the window at the brownstones garden, which at this time of year held nothing but architectural rain and dead stems. The murder of Dorian Swell tells us several things beyond the obvious. First, it was decisive. No hesitation, no intermediate step of intimidation or bribery attempted first. The killer judged that Swell could not be contained and acted accordingly. That is the decision of someone who has too much at stake to negotiate. Second, the framing of Marcus Teal, whether by design or by opportunistic exploitation of existing circumstance, suggests someone who was aware of the friction between Swell and Teal, and knew it could be made to serve as a credible alternative narrative. That awareness implies someone inside the organization. All 4 of them are inside. Yes, and one of them is our murderer. He picked up his beer glass, found it empty, and set it down with mild disappointment. What is your sense of Halverson, the son? Careful. Very. He gave me the shape of answers without the substance. Never refused to answer, but never said anything that could be used against him either. Either he's protecting himself because he's involved, or he's protecting the foundation because that's his instinct, and he's been doing it since he took the chairmanship. Is there a distinction that matters? I'm not sure yet. Wolfe was quiet for a moment. Archie, the police file. Has Miss Marsh obtained anything? She left a message this morning. Her lawyer has a contact in the DA's office who can get us the public portions of the investigative record. We should have it by tomorrow. Good. And the authentication documentation for the collection? She's pulling it from the Foundation's archives. Should take a day or 2. Wolfe nodded. In the meantime, I want you to speak with Marcus Teal. He's in custody. He has a defense attorney, presumably, since Miss Marsh has been supporting his defense. Contact the attorney. Explain that we are working in Teal's interest and require a consultation. The attorney will be motivated to cooperate, as any competent defense attorney would be, upon learning that someone is actively investigating the actual killer. I want to know what Teal says about the night of October 7th, not the police version, his version, in detail. I wrote it down. Anything specific you want me to ask him? Yes, said Wolfe. Ask him what Dorian Swell said to him the last time they spoke. Not the conversation the police say led to the argument. The last genuine conversation, before the relationship deteriorated. People who are about to act on a dangerous discovery often behave differently in the days preceding it. Not dramatically. They don't announce themselves. But they change in small ways. They look at familiar things as though they're seeing them for the first time. They ask unusual questions. They say things that only become significant in retrospect. I want to know if Swell said anything like that to Teal. I got Marcus Teal's attorney, a woman named Sylvia Feld from a midtown firm, on the phone that afternoon. She was, as Wolfe had predicted, motivated to cooperate. We arranged a meeting at the Rikers Island Visitor Facility for Thursday morning. That evening, the police file arrived via messenger. It was, in the language of such things, selective. The portions the DA's office was willing to share, but it told us enough. Dorian Swell, age 41, had been found dead in his apartment at 6:45 a.m. on October 7th by his upstairs neighbor, who had been alerted by his dog. Cause of death, blunt force trauma to the posterior of the skull, single blow, consistent with a heavy cylindrical object. Time of death, per the medical examiner, between 9 p.m. and midnight on October 6th. Marcus Teal had been identified as the last person known to have visited Swell's apartment on the night of the 6th, following a phone call between them at 7:30 p.m., a call that, per the police account, had been preceded by a contentious exchange of text messages earlier in the day. A neighbor reported hearing raised voices from Swell's apartment at approximately 8:45 p.m. Teal admitted to being at the apartment, admitted to an argument, but stated he left at approximately 9:15 p.m. and that Swell was alive when he departed. No weapon had been found. Teal's fingerprints were on the doorknob and the kitchen counter, consistent with his claim of having been inside, but not on anything that might have been a murder weapon. The apartment showed no signs of forced entry. I read through it twice, then took it in to Wolfe. He read it once, which was sufficient. The weapon, he said. Not found, I confirmed. If Teal had killed Swell in the heat of an argument, the weapon would most likely have been something at hand, whatever was nearest. A lamp, a book, any heavy object, readily available. And, in a panic, he might have taken it. But there's no indication of any missing objects from the apartment, according to this. He tapped the file. Alternatively, if the actual killer entered after Teal left, they brought a weapon with them, used it, and took it away. That is not a crime of passion. That is an execution carried out by someone who planned it. Someone who knew Teal had been there, I said. Or who had been watching the building. Or who had been watching Swell for some time and recognized that the evening of October 6th, with Teal's heated visit on record, was the optimal moment. The argument provided cover before it happened. Wolfe looked at the file for a moment longer. There is one more thing worth noting. The argument between Teal and Swell was over what, precisely? I checked. The text messages earlier in the day. Teal was apparently angry that Swell had told someone, the messages don't specify who, that Teal had made an error in cataloging a piece. A significant error, apparently, that Teal felt he'd been unfairly blamed for. Wolfe went still in the particular way that indicates not relaxation, but arrested motion. The stillness of a mind that has just encountered something it wants to turn over very slowly. An error in cataloging, he said. What kind of error? Doesn't say. No, said Wolfe softly, it wouldn't. He was quiet for a long moment. Archie, tomorrow, when you speak with Teal, ask him specifically what the cataloging error was, what piece was involved, and what the nature of the error was. Be very specific. Something in his tone made me look up from my notes. You have a theory? I have a suspicion, he said, which is preferable in some ways. A theory wants to be confirmed. A suspicion is willing to be destroyed. He rose from his chair. Dinner in 20 minutes. Fritz has done something with a leg of lamb that I expect will merit extended appreciation. I looked at the police file and thought about a young man sitting in a cell on Rikers Island who had argued with a dead man over a cataloging error that Nero Wolfe had just found extremely interesting. Outside, the rain had not let up. In this city, October rain has a certain quality, a gray, purposeful insistence that seems personal, as though the weather has decided it agrees with something the streets are already saying. I stood at the window for a moment and watched it hit the glass. Dorian Swell had discovered that some of the stones he'd spent his career authenticating had been swapped for beautiful lies, and the discovery had cost him everything. Somewhere in the city, the person who had made those beautiful lies was watching the rain too, and feeling, probably, the particular satisfaction of someone who believes they have solved their problem permanently. They were wrong about that, but they didn't know it yet. Wolfe held court on Friday morning. I'd spent Thursday on Rikers Island with Marcus Teal and his attorney, Sylvia Feld, in a visitation room that smelled of institutional disinfectant, and something underneath it that no amount of institutional disinfectant can fully address. Teal was not what I'd expected. I'd built a mental image of him from the police file's implications. The hot-tempered assistant, the argument, the raised voices. And what I found instead was a slender, serious young man of mixed race, with close-cropped hair and the careful, guarded manner of someone who has been very frightened for several weeks and has decided that appearing calm is the only form of dignity available to him. He told me about the argument with Swell, clearly and without apparent embellishment. He'd been furious about Swell's attribution of the cataloging error to him. The error, and here Wolfe's instinct announced itself as accurate, had been in the description of a 2nd-century Roman portrait bust, a piece known internally as the Tarquinio head. Teal had entered it in the catalogue, with a provenance note referencing an auction at Sotheby's, Geneva, in 1987. Swell had told someone, Teal believed it was Nance, that Teal had gotten the provenance wrong, that the correct auction was Sotheby's, Geneva, in 1979, 8 years earlier. Was he right? I asked. Teal had looked at me steadily. That's the thing. I checked the original documentation. The documentation says 1987. I copied it directly from the acquisition file. He paused. When I told Dorian that, he went very quiet. He asked me to send him the file. And then 3 hours later he called me and said never mind, he'd looked at it again and I was right. It was 1987. He'd misspoken to Dr. Nance. He told me not to worry about it. Another pause. But he didn't sound like someone who thought it was a minor mistake. He sounded like someone who had just understood something very large and was trying not to show it. I asked him about Swell's behavior in the weeks before his death. Yes, he said. Swell had been distracted, more meticulous than usual about documentation, pulling files, cross-referencing records, requesting authentication reports that predated Teal's time at the Foundation. He had also, on 2 occasions, stayed late in the building alone, late enough that the security log showed him leaving after 10 p.m., which was unusual. And the last genuine conversation before the argument? I asked. Teal thought carefully. 2 weeks before Swell's death, they had been working late on acquisition research together. Swell had looked up from his desk at one point and said, apparently apropos of nothing, Marcus, do you know what the Romans valued most in a portrait? Veritas, truth. They didn't idealize their subjects the way the Greeks did. They carved the warts, the asymmetries, the signs of age. Because to idealize was to falsify, and to falsify was to disrespect both the subject and the viewer. He'd gone back to his papers. And then, almost to himself, he'd said, someone has been disrespecting everyone for a very long time. I had thanked Teal, told him we were working in his interest, and driven back to the brownstone. Wolfe had listened to this account Friday morning with the same carefully managed stillness, and at the end of it he had said, the 1987 versus 1979 distinction. In your judgment, was Teal lying? No, I said. He was telling me exactly what happened. Then here is what happened, said Wolfe. Swell made what he believed was a legitimate correction to Teal's catalog entry. Then Teal showed him the original documentation, which said 1987. And in that moment, Swell understood that it was not Teal who had erred. The original acquisition documentation had been altered. The provenance had been changed. And the question was, changed from what to what, and by whom, and why? He folded his hands. An antiquity's provenance is its identity. Change its ownership history by 8 years, and you may be hiding the true source. You may be obscuring that the piece was not legitimately acquired in 1987, but under different, perhaps legally questionable circumstances in 1979. Or, he paused meaningfully, you may be substituting a different piece's documentation for the piece currently in your collection. A genuine piece sold elsewhere, its documentation now attached to a forgery in your vault. And Swell realized this when Teal showed him the original file, I said, and immediately began pulling every file he could find, looking for other inconsistencies. And someone knew he was doing it, and knew what it meant. He told me to arrange the interviews for that afternoon. By 2 o'clock, I had called each of the 4 Foundation figures and conveyed that Nero Wolfe, retained in connection with the Halverson Foundation and the matter of Dorian Swell's death, required their presence at the brownstone on West 35th Street at 3 o'clock. I told them it was not optional without being impolite about it, which is an art I've had some practice at. Galt protested. Nance asked questions I deflected. Petra Swell said she'd be there. Elliot Halverson said, in a voice that had been trained to convey authority, I'll want to know more about what this is regarding. I told him he'd find out at 3, which he didn't enjoy, but accepted. They arrived within 10 minutes of each other. I put them in the front room, which functions as a waiting room when the office is occupied, and brought them in 2 at a time, because Wolfe prefers to triangulate. He started with Nance and Halverson together. The 2 men sat in the client's chairs. I brought in a third from the hall, and Wolfe looked at them from behind his desk with the expression of a man reviewing a theorem. "Gentlemen," he said, "I will be direct. I have been engaged to establish the innocence of Marcus Teal, and consequently, the identity of the person who murdered Dorian Swell. I have concluded that Swell's death was connected to a forgery operation within the Halverson Foundation collection. I want your responses to that conclusion." Halverson's jaw tightened fractionally. "That's an extraordinary allegation." "It is an accurate one," Wolfe said. "The question is not whether it occurred. The question is who perpetrated it, and for how long. Mr. Nance, you were the Foundation's curator during the period when the primary collection was being assembled. If documentation for acquisitions had been altered, it would have required either your knowledge or your signature to be bypassed." Nance met his eyes steadily. "That's correct. And I would have known. My procedures are—" "Tell me about the Tarquinio head." A pause. Not long, but a pause nonetheless. "It's a 2nd century portrait bust. Excellent quality. Acquired in 1987 or 1979. Another pause. 1987. Sotheby's, Geneva. And yet documentation in your acquisition files at one point referenced 1979, which is why Dorian Swell corrected what he believed was Marcus Teal's error. Until Teal showed Swell the file. At which point, Swell understood that the documentation had been altered and began a systematic review of the collection." Wolfe watched Nance carefully. "I am not yet in a position to say whether you altered that documentation, or whether you were deceived yourself. I am asking you to help me determine which." Nance's composure held, but it was doing visible work. "I didn't alter anything," he said. "If there's an inconsistency in that documentation, it happened without my knowledge." "Then who had access to those files?" "The files are physical documents in the archive room. Staff with archive access. Dorian, myself, Miss Marsh, Raymond Galt for financial cross-referencing, and the chairman's office." Halverson, who had been sitting very still, said, "I want my attorney present." "You are not accused of anything, Mr. Halverson," Wolfe said mildly. "You are being interviewed. However, you are free to bring counsel to any subsequent conversation. For now, I ask you only this. In the 3 years since your father's death, have you had any reason to doubt the integrity of the collection?" A long pause. "No," Halverson said. Wolfe looked at him steadily for 3 seconds. "Thank you. That will do for now." He sent them out and brought Galt and Petrus Swell in together, which I thought was either strategically precise or slightly cruel. It turned out to be both. Galt came in with the hearty confidence slightly dialed back. He'd been in the front room for 40 minutes, and the wait had done its work. Petrus Swell sat beside him and looked at Wolfe with the clear, focused gaze of a person who has decided to pay very careful attention. "Mr. Galt," Wolfe began, "you had access to the Foundation's acquisition files. You also had access to the donor processing accounts. 6 months ago, an irregularity of approximately $14,000 was flagged to you by Miss Marsh. You told her it was a clerical error. Was it?" Galt's face went through something. "Of course it was." "You provided no documentation of the correction." It was internal. I handled it." "With what mechanism?" Wolfe asked pleasantly. "What account entry corrected it? What record was created?" "I will of course be reviewing the Foundation's financial records through Miss Marsh, so your answer will be verifiable." The confidence was no longer hearty. It was being carefully maintained, like a structure with a failing foundation, an apt metaphor given the setting. "I'll need to review the records myself before I can give you the specific entry." "I'm sure you will." Wolfe turned to Petrus Swell. "Miss Swell, your brother told you he was working through something complicated. and would tell you when he was sure. In the time between that conversation and his death, did he give you any indication, however indirect, of what it was? She'd clearly been ready for this. He called me 3 days before he died, she said. He asked me whether I'd ever had access to the archive room after hours. I said I didn't have archive access. Only Dorian and the senior staff did. He seemed relieved by that. He also asked me whether Raymond had ever asked me to sign anything on his behalf. Foundation documents, anything. In my peripheral vision, Galt went very still. And, Wolfe said. Once, Petra said. About 8 months ago. Raymond said he needed a second witness signature on a donor acknowledgement letter, and the regular witness was out. I signed it. I didn't think anything of it. What was the donor letter acknowledging? She shook her head. I don't remember the specific content. A gift acknowledgement of some kind. Do you still have a copy? No. Raymond handled the paperwork. Wolfe looked at Galt. Galt was now a man who had realized, in the last 30 seconds, that a conversation he'd considered safely buried had just surfaced in the one place he'd taken greatest care to keep it submerged. Mr. Galt, Wolfe said, his voice taking on the quality it reserves for moments when the pressure dial has been fully engaged. I want you to understand something clearly. A man is dead. A young man is in custody for a murder he did not commit. And the thread that connects these two facts leads by a route I have substantially mapped through the Halverson Foundation's financial and archival records. Records to which you had comprehensive access. I am not a law enforcement officer. I cannot compel you to speak. But I will tell you what I have observed in this conversation. Your face has confirmed 3 things I suspected. I will discover the 4th without your assistance, and the 5th, and whatever number is ultimately required. You may at that point find it useful to have cooperated earlier. That is entirely your calculation to make. Galt said nothing. His expression had arrived somewhere I recognized. The face of a man whose strategy has just been reduced to waiting and hoping. Wolfe waited 10 seconds, then said, "Thank you all. Archie will see you out." After they left, I came back into the office and looked at Wolfe. He had his eyes closed and his fingertips pressed together in a tent before his face, which meant active conclusion forming. "It's Galt," I said. "Galt is involved," Wolfe said. "Whether he is solely responsible or whether he required a partner, that I do not yet know. The donor letter Petra Swell signed is significant. He used her signature to create a legitimizing document for something. We need to find what that something was. The financial records. Yes. And one more thing." He opened his eyes. Nance paused twice. Once on the Tarquinio head date, once when I mentioned altered documentation. The second pause was marginally longer. He is not as uninvolved as he claims. He reached for his beer. But a pause is not evidence. We need evidence. "Then let's go get it," I said. "You will go get it," he said. "I will stay here and think," which is a considerably more efficient deployment of available resources. He was not wrong about that, irritating as it was to admit. There is a particular kind of Friday afternoon in Midtown Manhattan, gray-skied, purposeful, smelling of exhaust and ambition, that makes a man feel the city is about to reveal something it has been keeping to itself all week. I walked east on 42nd Street with my hands in my coat pockets, and the particular heightened awareness of a man who knows he is looking for a thread, and suspects it is somewhere in the next few hours. Wolfe had given me 3 assignments for the day. The first was to obtain, through Sylvia Feld's paralegal connections, whatever donor processing records from the Halverson Foundation could be legally accessed or subpoenaed on Marcus Teal's behalf. The second was to visit the offices of Whitmore and Chase, the auction house whose 1987 Sotheby's Geneva records were supposedly the provenance source for the Tarquinio head. The third was a conversation Wolfe had arranged, through channels I was not entirely clear on and had learned not to ask about, with a man named Gerald Pitt, a retired specialist from the FBI's art crime team who had spent 20 years tracking the international movement of stolen and forged antiquities. I did them in reverse order of convenience. Gerald Pitt lived in a one-bedroom apartment on the Upper West Side that was so thoroughly lined with books and files that you got the impression the furniture had been added as an afterthought to the real architecture. He was 71, compact, with a neat white mustache and the permanently skeptical expression of a man who has spent 2 decades being lied to by very sophisticated people. "Nero Wolfe," he said, when I introduced myself and mentioned who'd sent me. "I know the name. He consulted on a looted Etruscan bronzes case about 10 years ago. Identified the middleman from a photograph of an auction catalog. Impressive." He waved me to a chair, one of 3 in the apartment, not occupied by stacked files. "What do you need?" I told him about the Halverson Foundation, the suspected forgery scheme, and the characteristics we'd identified. High quality, museum grade, substituted originals, likely sold through private channels. He nodded slowly, the way men do when they're hearing a familiar pattern identified correctly. "Late Republican and early Imperial Roman sculpture. That's a very specific market. The buyers are a relatively small community. Serious collectors, a handful of museums, with acquisition budgets that can absorb a private purchase. The sellers, when they're operating outside legitimate channels, are even smaller." He went to one of his file stacks and began moving through it with the casual precision of a man who has an internal indexing system nobody else could replicate. The challenge with forged Roman marble is the marble itself. You can date the stone with reasonable accuracy now, isotope analysis, surface weathering patterns, but the forgeries you're describing would have to have passed expert scrutiny. That means either the forger had access to genuinely antique marble, a common source is Roman rubble, architectural fragments without artistic significance, or the pieces were not traditional forgeries. What's the alternative? He found what he was looking for, a manila folder, somewhat battered, and set it on his knee. The alternative is substitution. Real piece goes out. Very good reproduction, not a complete fake, but a piece based on the original with similar marble stock, goes in. The reproduction is made to match the original closely enough that casual inspection, even expert inspection at normal viewing distance, doesn't catch it. The original is then sold privately to a buyer who asks no questions. He opened the folder. There's a name that's come up in art crime circles for about 8 years. Never enough to prosecute. Operating somewhere in the intersection of legitimate antiquities dealing and private placement of pieces with unclear provenance. Goes by the working name in the trade of columna. Columna, I repeated. Latin for pillar, column. Ironic, given what he deals in. Pitt looked at me over his mustache. The profile is consistent with someone who has institutional access. Works within a legitimate structure, not outside it. Uses the institution's credibility to authenticate pieces that are then quietly replaced. He paused. The operation requires 2 things above all. First, someone who understands the collection from the inside, knows which pieces can be reproduced convincingly, knows which have limited external scholarly attention, so discrepancies won't be caught by outside scrutiny. Second, someone with the financial infrastructure to move significant sums without triggering reporting requirements. An acquisitions expert and a financial officer. Pitt looked at me with the expression of a man who finds someone else's conclusions satisfying. That would be the natural division of labor, yes. I asked him if columna had ever been associated with a specific geography or network. New York and Geneva primarily. There's an auction house connection, not one of the majors, a smaller firm, Corvath Fine Arts, based in Geneva, that also maintains a New York representation. They've handled several pieces over the years that were difficult to fully trace. He wrote a name and phone number on a notepad and handed it to me. This is a contact at Interpol's Cultural Property Unit. If pieces from the Halverson collection were sold through private channels in the last few years, there may be a trace. I thanked him and left, feeling that the thread had thickened considerably. From Pitt's apartment, I took a cab to the offices of a records researcher named Helen Sue. who works out of a building on Lexington and has, through years of connections and an encyclopedic familiarity with corporate and nonprofit filing systems, the ability to locate financial documents that other people would prefer remained located only where they currently are. I'd called her the previous day. She'd spent the intervening time pulling what she could from publicly available foundation filings, and through Sylvia Feld's subpoena authority from the foundation's donor processing account records for the past 3 years. "It's interesting," she said, spreading printouts across her desk with the unhurried efficiency of someone who has already done the interesting part and is now narrating it for someone else's benefit. The foundation processes donor contributions through 2 accounts. The primary operating account is clean, straightforward, well-documented, properly reported. The secondary account, listed in the filings as an acquisition facilitation fund, is considerably less so. "Define less so," I said. 18 transfers over the past 32 months, ranging from $42,000 to $380,000. Outgoing to a series of numbered accounts in Switzerland and the Cayman Islands. Total outflow, approximately $2.4 million. I let that sit for a moment. Documented as what? Each one has a corresponding acquisition record, a piece supposedly purchased from a private dealer. But here's the thing. She tapped one of the printouts. The acquisition records exist in the Foundation's financial system, but cross-referencing them with the physical collection catalog, which Miss Marsh provided to the subpoena, 7 of the 18 acquisitions have no corresponding entry in the collection. No piece, no location, no catalog number. The money went out for pieces that don't exist, I said. Or that do exist, but not in the Foundation. She looked at me steadily. The authorization signatures on the acquisition payment records are interesting too. Most are countersigned by the CFO and the acquisitions consultant. A few of the earlier ones, the 3 smallest, which I think were probing the system, have a second witness signature from someone in the Events and Development Office. Petra Swell, used by Galt before she or Swell knew what was being authorized. "The CFO's name on all of them?" I asked. "Raymond Galt. Every single one." I thanked Helen Sue, paid her rate, and went out into the afternoon. The Whitmore and Chase auction records errand was more straightforward. The firm's archive desk, staffed by a young man with the scholarly patience of someone who loves paper, confirmed after 40 minutes of searching that a piece matching the Tarquinio head description, a 2nd-century Roman portrait bust from the Claudian period, had indeed been sold at a Sotheby's Geneva auction in 1979, not 1987. The 1987 date in the Foundation's altered documentation was a fabrication. The real piece had been sold in 1979, which meant its provenance history ran 8 years earlier, an 8-year period during which it could have passed through additional hands. Hands that might not have wanted a direct line drawn from the 1979 sale to the Foundation's acquisition. Or, more specifically, the piece currently sitting in the Halverson Foundation's vault, under the Tarquinio head designation, was not the piece sold in Geneva in 1979. The original had been quietly removed and sold elsewhere, and the date change was meant to obscure the substitution by making it harder to trace the real piece's ownership history. Dorian Swell had pulled that thread, and it had unraveled enough of the scheme that someone had decided he needed to stop. I called Wolfe from a payphone. He dislikes cellular phones with a passion that predates their ubiquity and has not softened with time, and gave him a summary. There was a silence that lasted approximately 8 seconds, which from Wolfe is the equivalent of a long whistle. "Corvath Fine Arts," he said. "Geneva and New York." That's what Pitt said. "I know of Corvath. Peripheral reputation in the trade. Never prosecuted." Another pause. "Archie, find out if Raymond Galt has any documented connection to Corvath Fine Arts. Travel, financial, professional." "That's going to take some digging." "Then dig," he said. "Also, Frederick Nance, in 1979, where was he professionally?" I hadn't thought to ask. "I'll find out." "Good. Come home by 7. Fritz has made a cassoulet that he considers important, and I have no intention of letting your work schedule compromise his. I found out about Nance from a 30-year-old directory of classical studies faculty positions, accessed at the main branch of the New York Public Library, with the help of a reference librarian who had the focused enthusiasm of someone given an unusual puzzle. In 1979, Frederick Nance had been a junior acquisitions consultant, not to a museum, not to a foundation, but to a private antiquities dealer based in Geneva. The firm's name had been Corvath Fine Arts. I stood at the library desk and looked at that entry for a long moment. Then I wrote it down, very carefully, and went home. Wolfe was in the office when I arrived, reading a book about Byzantine administrative procedure, with the focused pleasure of a man who considers any knowledge eventually useful. He listened without moving. When I finished, he closed the book. Nance, he said quietly, worked for Corvath in 1979. Corvath sold a piece that appears in the Halverson Foundation collection under a falsified date. Nance subsequently joined the Halverson Foundation as its first curator, responsible for authenticating the initial collection. Galt joined the foundation 7 years later as CFO. He paused. The question is whether Nance and Galt found each other inside the foundation, or whether Nance brought Galt in. Or whether Nance is entirely clean and it's a coincidence, I said, without much conviction. A man works for Corvath Fine Arts in 1979. A piece sold by Corvath in 1979 appears in the foundation he subsequently joins, with a falsified date that obscures the Corvath connection. $2,400,000 flows out of the foundation through accounts that cannot be traced. He looked at me steadily. That is not a coincidence, Archie. That is a biography. He reached for his beer. Tomorrow I will need to speak with Celestine Marsh, and I will need to ask her something that will be difficult for her to answer. What? Whether Cornelius Halverson, the founder, the man who assembled the initial collection, knew. I hadn't gotten there yet. I got there now. If the scheme began with the initial collection, before Galt arrived, then the man who assembled that collection, with Nance as his primary authenticator, was either deceived by the man he trusted most, or was not entirely innocent himself. Either way, it meant Elliot Halverson had inherited something considerably more complicated than a philanthropy. He's been dead 3 years, I said. Yes, said Wolfe, which makes him very convenient. He opened his book again. The cassoulet will be ready in 10 minutes. I suggest you wash your hands. You've been in archives. I washed my hands, and then I sat at my desk and looked at my notes and thought about a man named Dorian Swell who had pulled a thread and followed it all the way to where it began, and had understood, too late and alone, the full dimension of what he'd found. The cassoulet was, as Fritz had promised himself, important. I ate it without tasting much of it. Some evenings the food and the thinking don't keep pace with each other, and you have to let one of them go. I let the food go. The thinking stayed. Saturday morning in the brownstone has a quality distinct from the rest of the week. Wolfe breakfasts at 8, goes to the plant rooms at 9, and returns at 11. In that 2-hour interval, the house achieves a kind of productive quiet. Fritz moving in the kitchen, the grandfather clock in the hall keeping its counsel, the office empty and waiting. I use it to think, which I do best when nothing is requiring me to do anything else. I had my notes spread across my desk by 8:15, and was working through them with a fresh pot of coffee, when the shape of it began to clarify. Here is what we had. Nance had worked for Corvath Fine Arts in Geneva in 1979. Corvath had sold a piece in 1979 that was now in the Halverson collection under a falsified 1987 date. Nance had joined the Halverson Foundation at its inception 12 years ago, serving as its first and senior curator, the man responsible for authenticating the initial collection, the 60-odd pieces that formed its permanent core. Galt had joined 7 years ago, 5 years after the foundation was established. His arrival corresponded, if the financial records were a reliable guide, with the beginning of the Acquisition Facilitation Fund transfers. The $2.4 million that had flowed outward over 32 months. Which meant the scheme had two phases. The first phase predated Galt. The initial collection, assembled under Nance's authentication, may have contained substitutions from the beginning. Pieces Nance knew were reproductions, authenticated by Nance himself, with the originals either sold through Corvath or retained for later private sale. This phase was quiet, established, essentially frozen. The collection sat in its vault, and the substitutions sat with it, generating no income but maintaining no risk. The second phase began with Galt. The Acquisition Facilitation Fund became the mechanism for ongoing extraction. New acquisitions that existed only on paper, money flowing out to accounts in Geneva and the Caymans. Nance providing the authenticating cover for pieces that were either reproduced and substituted or never acquired at all. Dorian Swell had been hired 6 years ago, a year after Galt arrived. He was brought in, presumably, as a legitimate acquisitions consultant, whose expertise would provide the Foundation with genuine scholarly credibility. He had not been brought in on the scheme. He was, in the language of such arrangements, the honest man whose reputation launders the dishonest operation simply by being present and real. For 5 years, apparently, that had worked. And then Swell had discovered the Tarquinio head inconsistency, and begun pulling threads. The question Wolfe had raised the previous evening, whether Cornelius Halverson had known, was the critical one, because it determined the scope. If the founder had known, then the original sin of the Foundation was his, and the operation had been built into the institution from its creation. If he hadn't known, then Nance had been deceiving his patron from the beginning, smuggling a corrupted collection into a legitimate foundation, and then 7 years later, bringing in a financial accomplice to expand the extraction. The difference mattered to Wolfe for a specific reason. If the founder had been complicit, then the son might know, might have inherited not just the chairmanship, but the arrangement. And that would make Elliot Halverson either a participant or a victim. And Wolfe needed to know which before the final confrontation. Celestine Marsh arrived at 11, punctual to the minute, while Wolfe was still in his plant rooms. I gave her coffee, and she sat in the client's chair with the composed readiness of someone who has been bracing for news. "We've found the financial trail," I told her. "The Acquisition Facilitation Fund. $2.4 million, 32 months, accounts in Switzerland and the Caymans." She absorbed this without visible surprise. "Raymond," she said. "Yes, and Nance." That one landed harder. She set her coffee cup down carefully. "Frederick," she said. "He worked for Corvath Fine Arts in Geneva in 1979. Corvath sold the original Tarquinio head. The documentation in your Foundation's files ties to Corvath through the date falsification. We believe Nance authenticated the initial collection, some or all of it, with knowledge that certain pieces were reproductions, the originals either sold through Corvath or retained. Galt arrived later, and they built the second phase together." She was quiet for a long moment, the kind of quiet that isn't absence of thought, but the presence of it, working rapidly. "The Foundation's entire scholarly reputation," she said finally, "rests on the collection. If the collection is substantially forged, we don't know how many pieces are affected. It may be a minority. It may be more than that." I paused. "Miss Marsh, Wolfe needs to ask you something about Cornelius Halverson." She looked at me steadily. "Is there any reason to believe he knew?" Another long silence. "No," she said. "And yes." She turned to look at the window. "Cornelius Halverson was a passionate collector. He trusted Frederick Nance completely, had known him for years before the Foundation was established. Frederick was the expert, and Cornelius deferred to expertise he respected." She stopped. But Cornelius also did not ask many questions about acquisition costs. He made the money available and trusted Frederick to manage the details. Whether that was innocent faith or deliberate incuriosity. She spread her hands slightly. "I genuinely don't know," He's dead. I can't ask him. What about Elliot? I asked. Elliot took over 3 years ago. He inherited the financial reports, the collection catalog, the whole institutional structure. If there were signs of irregularity, they were, as I can now see, carefully buried in the Acquisition Facilitation Fund, which had its own documentation structure. She paused. Elliot is not an expert. He is a competent administrator and a devoted custodian. He would not have known what to look for. Wolfe came in at 11:15, with a cutting from one of his oncidiums, which he was examining with the attention he normally reserves for key evidence. He set it in a small vase on the corner of his desk, settled into his chair, and looked at Marsh. "You have been told the outline," he said, not asking. "Yes. I want to speak about the night of October 6th. He folded his hands. Dorian Swell was at the Foundation building late, on at least 2 occasions, in the 2 weeks before his death. The security log confirms this. What was he doing? Reviewing the archive files, Marsh said. He told me he was cross-referencing acquisition records against the physical catalog. He was building a systematic picture. Who else had access to the building after hours? Senior staff have keycards. Nance, Galt, myself, Elliot as chairman, and Dorian, of course. And the security log for the night of October 6th, the night Swell was murdered? Was anyone else in the building? Marsh hesitated. I checked that this morning, before I came here. Dorian's card was used to exit at 8:47 p.m. on October 6th. And Frederick Nance's card was used to enter at 8:52, 5 minutes after Swell left. Does the log show when Nance exited? Wolfe asked. 10:21 p.m. Nance had been in the building for nearly 90 minutes on the night Swell was murdered, entering 5 minutes after Swell left. The medical examiner had placed time of death between 9 p.m. and midnight. Did you speak with Nance that evening? Wolfe asked Marsh. No, I wasn't in the building. Has he offered any account of why he was there? I haven't asked him. I didn't know about the log until this morning. She looked at Wolfe directly. Do you think it was Frederick? Wolfe was quiet for a moment, the particular stillness of a man withholding something he has already concluded. I think the building log is significant, he said carefully. I also think it is not the whole picture. He looked at his oncidium cutting. I want you to do something that will require composure. I want you to speak with Elliot Halverson today. Tell him that an investigation is underway, that it is proceeding to a conclusion, and that he should make himself available to speak with me on Monday morning. Tell him nothing more than that. His reaction will be informative. His reaction to what specifically? To the knowledge that someone is closing in on the truth of his foundation. Wolfe's eyes moved to her face. If he is relieved, he is innocent. If he is afraid, he is involved. If he is angry, he may be either. Observe carefully. After Marsh left, I stood at the window with my coffee and watched the Saturday street below. A delivery truck, 2 women with a stroller, an elderly man with a dog that had clearly won every argument they'd ever had. You're not going to tell me which of them killed Swell, I said. No, said Wolfe. Because you don't know, or because you do and you're not ready to move? Because I know, and because the movement requires preparation. We are not yet in a position to act. He reached for his own coffee. There are things I know that evidence cannot yet support. And there are things the evidence supports that I must properly sequence before I expose them. Sequence matters, Archie. The truth presented in the wrong order convinces no one. So what happens Monday? Monday, I will speak with Elliot Halverson, and I will make a phone call to a contact at the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, which Saul will arrange, regarding the structure of the Cayman accounts. He set his cup down. And I will need you to obtain one more thing. What? The Foundation's building security footage for the week of October 1st through October 7th. Not the log, the actual footage. There are cameras in the archive room corridor and the main entrance. He looked at me. If the footage is retained for 30 days, which is standard practice, it has not yet been overwritten. but 30 days from October 7th is next Thursday, which was 6 days away. I'll have it by Monday, I said. You will have it by Sunday, he said. I had it by Sunday. It required a call to the building security firm, a letter from Sylvia Feld citing the active murder defense, and 4 hours of my Saturday afternoon. But I had it. What it showed, when I reviewed it on Wolfe's large monitor with the lights out and a fresh coffee at my elbow, was this. On the night of October 6th, at 8:49 p.m., 2 minutes before the card log showed Nance entering, a figure appeared in the archive room corridor. The figure wore a long coat, kept their face angled away from the cameras, with the precision of someone who had noted the camera positions in advance, and spent 11 minutes in the corridor outside the archive room before leaving via the back stairwell. The figure's card was not logged, which meant they had used someone else's card or had found another way in. What I could see, in the brief moment when the figure turned toward the far end of the corridor, a flash of reddish-brown hair, and the build of a man who golfs. Wolfe spent Sunday reading, making 2 phone calls whose content he declined to share with me in advance, and eating a loin of pork that Fritz had prepared with a mustard and herb crust that was one of the finer arguments I'd encountered recently for the proposition that civilization has produced some things worth preserving. I spent Sunday reviewing the security footage 4 more times, confirming what I'd seen, and then writing up a complete summary of everything we had: the financial records, the Korvath connection, Nance's employment history, the building log, the footage, in the precise and organized format that Wolfe prefers when he is moving toward conclusion. He read it Sunday evening without comment, which is his version of approval. Monday began with Elliot Halverson. He arrived at 9:30, 20 minutes before Wolfe came down from the plant rooms, which was by design. I wanted to see him in the waiting room. He sat with his legs crossed and his hands in his lap, and his eyes moving around the room with the controlled assessment of a man taking inventory. Not nervous exactly, calculating. The question was what he was calculating. When Wolfe came in and settled, Elliot Halverson looked at him across the desk with the expression of a man who has decided on his approach in advance and intends to maintain it. Celestine told me you're investigating the matter of Dorian Swell's death and its connection to certain alleged irregularities in the Foundation. I want to say clearly at the outset that I am fully cooperative. If there have been irregularities, I want them exposed and corrected. My father built that institution on a foundation of integrity, and I won't see that compromised. It was a good speech, well constructed, positioned him correctly, committed him to cooperation without committing him to anything specific. Wolfe let a moment pass. Mr. Halverson, I appreciate the statement. Now tell me when you first suspected that Frederick Nance was stealing from the Foundation. Halverson's face did something carefully managed. I don't have reason to suspect Frederick specifically. The investigation is yours, not mine. You have had 3 years as chairman, Wolfe said. You are an intelligent man. The Acquisition Facilitation Fund, which is the mechanism through which approximately $2.4 million has left the Foundation, appears in the financial reports you review quarterly. Did nothing in those reports occasion concern? Those reports are audited by an auditing firm that has worked with the Foundation since its inception, recommended by Raymond Galt. Wolfe's tone was not unkind, but it was implacable. A firm that would have reviewed whatever documentation Galt provided and found it consistent with that documentation. He paused. I am not accusing you, Mr. Halverson. I am asking you what you knew. There is a significant difference between a man who participated in fraud and a man who chose not to look too closely at things that might have required him to act. I am asking which you are. A long silence. Halverson's hands, which had been still in his lap, moved to rest on the chair arms. I noticed, he said carefully, about 18 months ago, that the Acquisition Facilitation Fund had a higher outflow rate than seemed consistent with the collection growth. He stopped. I asked Raymond about it. He gave me an explanation about private acquisition costs, dealer relationships, confidentiality requirements in the private market. I accepted it. He met Wolfe's eyes. I accepted it because investigating further would have meant questioning Frederick's judgment in acquisitions, and my father trusted Frederick completely. I felt that questioning the collection was, he stopped again, was a kind of betrayal of my father. Wolfe said, "And the collection is your father's legacy," Wolfe said quietly. "Yes. So you chose the legacy over the question." Halverson said nothing. The silence was its own answer. "That is a human failure, Mr. Halverson," said Wolfe. "Not a legal one, but I want you to understand that Dorian Swell did not make the same choice. He chose the question, and it cost him his life. He let that land. Now I am going to tell you what will happen this week. I will present my conclusions to you and the relevant parties in this room on Thursday evening. I will have identified the person responsible for Dorian Swell's death. I will have documented the scheme thoroughly enough that the relevant authorities can proceed. And I will have established, beyond reasonable doubt, that Marcus Teal is innocent." He paused. "In the meantime, I want you to behave precisely as you normally would. No confrontations, no unusual communications, no indication to any person at the Foundation that anything is different from last week." Halverson nodded slowly. "And the Foundation?" "That," said Wolfe, "is a problem for Thursday evening and afterward. You will face it, and it will be considerable. But you will face it as a chairman who was deceived, not as a participant. Provided you do exactly as I say between now and Thursday." Halverson left looking 10 years older than he'd arrived, which was honest progress. The phone call Wolfe made to his FBI financial crimes contact confirmed, by Monday afternoon, that one of the Cayman accounts receiving transfers from the Foundation's Acquisition Facilitation Fund was linked to a corporate entity, Steel Holdings LLC, whose beneficial owner, through 2 levels of shell structure, was a man named Frederick Nance. Raymond Galt's name appeared in connection with a Swiss account, through a separate entity called Parnassus Asset Management, which had received transfers in the same 32-month period totaling approximately $800,000, which was considerably less than Nance's share. The division of spoils told its own story. Nance was the architect. Galt was the facilitator. The split reflected it. I sat with that for a moment, and then took it into Wolfe, who received it with the stillness of a man whose final arithmetic has just balanced. "The security footage," I said. "The figure in the corridor. Reddish-brown hair, golfer's build. That was Galt." "Yes," said Wolfe. "But the medical examiner puts time of death between 9 and midnight. Galt is on the footage at 8:49. If Swell was already home by then—" "Swell left the building at 8:47, Wolfe said. "He lived on West 81st Street, in a cab with reasonable traffic, perhaps 20 minutes. He would have arrived home between 9:05 and 9:15. The neighbor reported raised voices from Swell's apartment at 8:45, which was Marcus Teal's visit." He paused. "Galt was in the Foundation building for 11 minutes. What was he doing?" I thought about it. The archive files. Swell had been pulling them, cross-referencing the collection. If Galt knew Swell had been reviewing the files, he'd want to see what Swell had found, know the scope of the exposure. And having assessed it, he knew what needed to happen. Yes. Wolfe was quiet for a moment. Galt went to the building to understand what Swell had found. He then went to Swell's apartment. He had to have known that Teal had been there, either because he was watching or because he'd intercepted the text messages on a Foundation communication system. He knew Teal had argued with Swell. He understood what that meant. "He brought the weapon with him," I said. "He'd already decided." "He made a decision in the archive corridor," Wolfe said. "He arrived not yet committed to murder. He left committed to it." He turned to his orchids and regarded them for a long moment. "Archie, I want Nance here Thursday evening, and Galt, and Marsh, Halverson, and Petra Swell. Sylvia Feld should attend as Teal's attorney, and Inspector Kramer. Kramer, I said. Kramer was the head of homicide, a man who had a complicated relationship with Wolfe, involving equal parts professional respect and sustained exasperation. He's not going to enjoy being summoned to a gathering. He never does, Wolfe said. Call him and tell him I have identified the murderer of Dorian Swell and the evidence to support it, and that if he would like to be present for the conclusion, he should arrive at 8 o'clock Thursday evening. He will come. What do I tell Nance and Galt? Wolfe considered. Tell them the Foundation matter has reached a resolution that requires their presence. Do not alarm them unduly. I want them to come, not to run. He paused. Galt in particular. He will be calculating his risk. He needs to believe that the risk of not attending is greater than the risk of attending. What makes him believe that? Tell him, Wolfe said carefully, that I have spoken with his attorney. Which I have. A courtesy call. Nothing more. The implication that legal representation is already in the room will encourage him to want to be in the room himself. He rose from his chair, signaling the planning phase had ended. Thursday evening, 8 o'clock. I will need the afternoon to prepare. On Tuesday and Wednesday I kept myself busy with the preparations. Calls, arrangements, 2 conversations with Sylvia Feld about the evidentiary structure we were building for Marcus Teal's defense, and a visit to the FBI Financial Crimes Contact to deliver our documentation package. On Wednesday evening I sat in the office with a bourbon and read through the complete case file from beginning to end, the way you do when you want to make sure the structure is sound before the load is put on it. It was sound. The thread that had started with a date discrepancy on a provenance record, 1987 versus 1979, ran all the way back 30 years to a junior acquisitions consultant in Geneva, and forward through $2,400,000 and one dead man and a 23-year-old sitting in a cell on Rikers Island, to a brownstone on West 35th Street, where a very large man, with orchids and opinions, was about to put an end to it. I finished the bourbon and went to bed. I slept better than I expected to. Thursday evening arrived in the manner of important evenings, with an air of having been anticipated for long enough that it felt, by the time it appeared, slightly inevitable. Fritz had set out coffee service and a modest bar arrangement in the front room, which he does when Wolfe anticipates a gathering of consequence, as though the problem of civilization's tensions might be marginally reduced by the availability of a decent Burgundy. By 7:45, the brownstone's front room held 6 people in various states of outward composure. Celestine Marsh sat with the careful stillness of someone who has been managing the tension of the past 10 days through sheer organizational discipline, and is close enough to the end of it that she doesn't want to drop anything now. Petra Swell sat beside her, and I noticed that the grief in her face had acquired an edge. She had been told enough to know that this evening would produce answers, and the anticipation of answers, when the question involves your brother's murder, is its own particular quality of anguish. Elliot Halverson sat apart from the others in a high-backed chair, his face arranged in the chairman's expression he'd been refining for 3 years. He was holding a glass of water he hadn't drunk from. Sylvia Feld, Teal's attorney, sat with a legal pad and a pen, and the professional alertness of someone being paid to pay close attention. Raymond Galt had arrived 7 minutes late, not enough to be conspicuous, just enough to communicate that he had considered not coming and had decided. He sat with his jacket still on, and his posture expressing a hardiness that had been drained of all content. A shell of professional ease with nothing inside it. He did not look at Nance. Frederick Nance sat precisely, and looked at everything with the expression of a man who has been a scholar too long to abandon the analytical habit, even in extremis. His face was composed with the meticulous care of very fine plaster. He was, I thought, the more dangerous of the two, because his composure was real, not performed like Galt's, but actual, The equilibrium of a man who has lived with what he is for a very long time and has reached an accommodation with it. Inspector Kramer arrived at 3 minutes to 8, large and dissatisfied, with a plainclothes detective at his side. He looked at the assembled company with the expression of a man inventorying a situation he's been dropped into without a map. Said Goodwin to me, in a tone that communicated a complex range of feelings, and sat down in the corner chair I'd positioned for him. At 8 o'clock exactly, Nero Wolfe entered. He moved to the room's center with the unhurried authority of a man who has earned the right to take his time, surveyed the assembled faces with dark eyes that lingered nowhere and missed nothing, and lowered himself into the large chair I had placed for him. He had dressed for the occasion, a fresh suit, dark with a subtle pattern, which was the only concession he made to the theatrical dimension of what was about to happen. Wolfe does not believe in theater. He believes in logic, which is, he has told me, sufficiently dramatic on its own terms. "Thank you all for coming," he said, with the tone of a man who would have found a way to make you come if you hadn't. "I will be economical with the time. What I am about to describe will be uncomfortable for some of you, and painful for others. I ask only that you remain until I am finished." He paused. "Inspector Kramer, I have asked you here because at the conclusion of what I am about to say, you will have sufficient cause to act. I trust you will do so efficiently." Kramer said nothing, but his pen appeared. Wolfe folded his hands. 30 years ago, a young man named Frederick Nance worked for a private antiquities firm called Horvath Fine Arts, based in Geneva. Horvath operated in the gray zone of the international antiquities market, legitimate enough to avoid prosecution, flexible enough to handle pieces whose provenance did not bear close scrutiny. Nance was a talented scholar and an even more talented authenticator. He understood what a provenance document needed to say in order to pass as genuine. He learned this craft at Horvath, and he never forgot it. 12 years ago, Cornelius Halverson, a man of great passion for classical antiquity and considerable wealth, established the Halverson Foundation. He brought in Frederick Nance, whom he knew and trusted, to build and authenticate the primary collection. Nance did so, and into that collection, alongside genuine pieces, which I believe constitute a majority, he introduced a number of high-quality reproductions. The originals had been acquired for the Foundation legitimately, then quietly replaced. The originals were sold through private channels, at least some of them through Horvath, or its successors, with Nance retaining a substantial share of the proceeds. He paused. No one in the room moved, except Kramer, whose pen was moving. This initial phase of the operation was elegant in its restraint. It produced significant illicit income for Nance, while leaving the Foundation's reputation intact. Cornelius Halverson, I believe, did not know. He trusted Nance completely, and did not have the expertise to identify a reproduction from a genuine piece. He was deceived by the man he had entrusted with his life's work. Nance, across the room, said nothing. His face had not changed. Only the plaster quality of his composure had increased slightly, suggesting something working beneath it. 7 years ago, Wolfe continued, Raymond Galt joined the Foundation as Chief Financial Officer. I do not know whether Nance recruited him specifically, or whether the relationship developed once Galt understood what he had access to. What I know is that within his first year at the Foundation, an acquisition facilitation fund had been established under his financial management, and money had begun flowing outward through it, to accounts in Switzerland and the Cayman Islands, controlled through shell companies whose beneficial ownership traces, respectively, to Nance and Galt. In 32 months, approximately $2.4 million was extracted. Nance received the larger share, consistent with his position as the scheme's architect. Galt's hardiness had entirely vacated his face now. What remained was something flat and watchful, the face of a man who has run the calculation and found the marginals insufficient. 5 years ago, Wolfe said, Dorian Swell was engaged as senior acquisitions consultant. He was, to the operation, an insurance policy of sorts. a genuine expert whose reputation would lend credibility to the collection without his knowledge of what he was lending it to. And for 5 years, that arrangement worked. Swell was talented, conscientious, and, crucially, focused on new acquisitions and scholarly research, rather than auditing the existing collection's foundations. Then, several weeks ago, Swell noticed a discrepancy. In attempting to correct what he believed was an error made by his assistant, Marcus Teal, a provenance date for a piece known as the Tarquinio head, he was shown documentation that contradicted his correction. The piece's acquisition file stated 1987. The actual Sotheby's Geneva auction record for the piece placed it in 1979. 8 years of difference. He understood at once that the Foundation's documentation had been falsified, and began a systematic review of the collection's acquisition records. He turned to look at Nance directly. He found more, of course. He found the pattern, and he understood not merely that pieces had been substituted, but who had the access, the expertise, and the motive to have done it. He told Celestine Marsh that he believed he knew who was responsible. He did not name anyone. He said he needed one more piece of confirmation. Wolfe's gaze did not waver. The confirmation, I believe, was the Corvath connection, the chain that led from the Tarquinio head's real sale history back to the firm where Nance had worked in 1979. He was very close to having it when he was killed. "This is speculation," Nance said. His voice was even and controlled. A scholar's voice, making a procedural objection. "You have no direct evidence that I have your employment history," Wolfe said, "which connects you to Corvath. I have the Tarquinio head provenance falsification, which connects the Foundation's collection to Corvath's 1979 sale. I have the acquisitions facilitation fund transfers, which connect to a Cayman entity whose beneficial owner is you. I have authentication records, signed by you, for pieces that do not exist in the physical collection. And I have the testimony of a financial researcher and an FBI financial crimes analyst who have spent 3 days mapping the full structure." He paused. "That is not speculation. That is a biography of your crime." Nance said nothing more. The plaster had cracked, and underneath it was not emotion, but simply blankness, the face of a man who has run his own calculation and found the same margins. Wolfe turned to Galt. "You are the secondary actor in the scheme," he said, "the financial mechanism rather than the intellectual architect. But you are the primary actor in Dorian Swell's murder." The room went still in a different way. "On the evening of October 6th, Wolfe said, "Dorian Swell left the Halverson Foundation building at 8:47 p.m. He had been reviewing acquisition records. You, Mr. Galt, entered the building at 8:49, not through the main entrance, where your keycard would have registered, but through a secondary access point, using the occasion of the camera's coverage gap in the loading corridor. We know this because a figure matching your physical description appears in the archive corridor security footage at that time. A figure who had taken care to avoid direct camera angles, indicating prior knowledge of camera positions." He paused. "You spent 11 minutes in the archive room corridor. You examined what Swell had been reviewing. You understood the scope of what he had found." Galt had gone entirely still. Not the performed stillness of composure, but the involuntary stillness of a body that has stopped receiving cooperative signals from its nervous system. "You went to Dorian Swell's apartment on West 81st Street. You knew that Marcus Teal had been there earlier. You had access to the Foundation's communication systems, and were aware of the conflict between them. You arrived after Teal had left, having confirmed through whatever observation that Swell was alone. You had brought a weapon, a cylindrical object, likely a section of pipe or a dense cylinder of some kind, which you have since disposed of." Wolfe's voice remained level. "You struck Dorian Swell once, from behind. You took the weapon and left, and you allowed a 23-year-old man, whose argument with Swell earlier that evening was a matter of record, to be arrested for a murder you committed." Galt said, "I want my attorney." Your attorney, Wolfe said, was notified of this meeting as a courtesy, and has presumably been expecting your call. Inspector Kramer will ensure you have the opportunity. Kramer was already standing. His detective was at the door. Mr. Kramer, Wolfe said, I will have a complete written summary of the evidentiary structure for you within the hour. Miss Feld will coordinate with your office regarding Marcus Teal's release. I trust the mechanical arrangements can proceed expeditiously. Don't tell me how to run my shop, Wolfe, Kramer said, but without the full weight of his usual exasperation, which from Kramer is a form of tribute. What followed was the necessary procedural machinery. Kramer's detective producing the formal caution, Galt's face doing the final transition from calculation to something grimmer and more settled. Sylvia Feld already on her phone, speaking quickly and with precision. Nance remaining in his chair with the stillness of a man who has decided that movement is no longer relevant, and is simply waiting for whatever comes next. Petra Swell had covered her face with her hands at some point during Wolfe's account of the murder. The woman beside her, Celestine Marsh, had put a hand on her arm and left it there, which was not a gesture Marsh seemed accustomed to making, and had made anyway. Elliot Halverson sat with his glass of water, still undrunk, and looked at the space where his father's foundation had been a moment ago, and tried, visibly, to locate what remained. After the police had gone, with Galt and Nance, after Feld had left with her phone pressed to her ear and the practiced urgency of someone arranging a motion to dismiss, after Halverson had sat for 20 minutes saying very little, and then departed with the expression of a man who has inherited a very difficult Monday morning, after Petra Swell had said, quietly, to no one in particular, he tried so hard to do the right thing, and then let Marsh walk her to a cab. After all of that, the brownstone was quiet. I sat in the office. Wolfe was at his desk with a book, apparently returned to Byzantine administration, with the equanimity of a man who has dispatched the urgent, and returned to the merely important. The cassoulet was better, I said. He looked up. I beg your pardon? Last Saturday, the cassoulet Fritz made. It was better than tonight's resolution, more satisfying. He regarded me with the expression he reserves for statements that he finds somewhere between illogical and personally offensive. The resolution was entirely satisfying. It was logical, complete, and will result in a man going free and 2 men being prosecuted. He paused. The cassoulet was also satisfying. There is no competition between them. I know, I said. I'm just talking. He returned to his book. Marcus Teal will be released by tomorrow afternoon, if Feld is competent, which she appears to be. She is. Good. He turned a page. The Foundation will face a period of considerable difficulty. Several pieces will need to be repatriated, or acknowledged as reproductions. Elliot Halverson will either burrow into his chairmanship, or be destroyed by it. That is not our concern. Nance, I said. He built something real alongside what he stole. The legitimate pieces in that collection, there are genuine ones. He was a real scholar. Yes, Wolfe said. The worst thieves often are. It is what makes them difficult to catch. He paused. What Swell said to his sister, that the Romans valued veritas above idealization. He was right, and it cost him his life, which is not a satisfying equation, but it is an honest one. He looked at me over the book. Go to bed, Archie. You've earned it. One question, I said. The theory you had, the one you said you were holding as a suspicion rather than a conclusion, when did it become a conclusion? He considered this with the genuine interest he gives to questions about his own reasoning. When you told me about the cataloging error, he said. The specific nature of it, a date discrepancy, 8 years, in provenance documentation. At that moment, I knew it was not a minor error, and not an innocent correction. I knew it was a window. The rest was simply a matter of opening it wide enough to see what was behind it. He paused. The marble, as I said, speaks, if you know how to listen. I went to bed. Outside, the October rain had finally stopped, and the street below was washed clean and quiet, reflecting the lights of the city in the wet pavement. A city of surfaces and depths, where the distance between what a thing appears to be and what it actually is can be variously a matter of 8 years, or $2,400,000, or a man's entire life. Marcus Teal was released at 11:43 the following morning, on a motion to dismiss supported by the evidentiary package Wolfe had delivered to Kramer's office. I read about it in the afternoon paper. There was a small photograph of him coming down the courthouse steps, with Sylvia Feld beside him. He looked thin and tired, and about 3 years older than 23. He also looked like a man who had just stepped back into a world that had continued without him, and was now, imperfectly, letting him back in. Which is what it was. I clipped the photograph and put it in the case file. Then I put the file in the drawer and turned back to whatever came next. Wolfe was upstairs with his orchids. Fritz was producing something that smelled like a very good future. And the brownstone on West 35th Street was, for the moment, quiet, waiting as it always does for the next knock at the door, and whoever is standing behind it with a story that only looks simple from the outside. They always look simple from the outside.